Hi everyone, welcome to the Kemet Queen Show. Today we have oh my god, I don't want to say special guest, like it's so cliche, so. Today we have
Yeah.
Karim Wafa with me on the Kemet Queen Show. This is going to be my first time interviewing anybody. So Karim, can you please introduce yourself to our viewers?
Hello, everybody. My name is Karim Wafa. I'm also known as Karim Wafa Al-Husseini. I am a historian, a researcher, a writer, a speaker, and a poet. I have two main areas of historical focus, passion, and specialization. One is on the Eastern world, and one is on the Western world. These are like the terms that I use. Concerning the Eastern world, my main areas of focus tend to be Arab, Middle Eastern, Islamic history, and the Indian Ocean trade. So any relationship between the Middle East and the Islamic world with the African continent and South Asia. And then concerning the Western world, I focus a lot on the Transatlantic and the Atlantic world. So the history of the Southern U.S., the slave trade as well, Central America and South America. And I tend to look at the different ways in which we can draw similarities and comparisons between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean worlds.
That's amazing. What made you become interested in these topics? These are pretty heavy topics.
One of my favorite questions. To be honest, I do believe that this was a journey of self-discovery for me because my case is different from a lot of my other Arab friends because I come from a very mixed family. I mean, both my parents are very mixed. Every single one of my grandparents and great-grandparents came from a different country everywhere in the Middle East. So whenever people ask me where I'm from, I just say I'm Arab. But I always wanted to know more about the history of the Middle East, about the history of North Africa, and about the African continent as well, because I know that I have ancestry from the Mediterranean, from Africa, from Central Asia as well. So to me, it was all at the beginning a journey of self-discovery. And I decided to examine the different ways in which the Arab world managed to come into connections with these different parts of the world and how they evolved. And many times we tend to have as Arabs or as people from the Middle East, like some misconceptions about like ancestry and identity. Just like people around the world tend to have this, especially nowadays, because people are talking more about ancestry and identity, which are very interesting topics. But for example, in my family, I know that like my dad took a DNA test last year and he got the results, and it was something we were not expecting at all. In general, when you get a DNA test, they give you by continent. So like Asia, Europe, Africa, the Americas, and then they break down the ethnicity. So for example, we were expecting 90% at least Asia, with the rest, the 10% being between Africa and Europe. So we know that we were colonized by the Europeans. We thought we would have some European ancestry. The results were completely different. My dad had 50% Asia and 50% Africa. So the Asia was all, we call in Arabic Bled al-Sham, which is like Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, and the Khalij, which is the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi, and Yemen, because that's where my family originates from Yemen and Saudi. But Africa was 45% ancient Egypt, and we had Morocco and Nigeria and Mauritania. So we also know that there is the input from West Africa and North Africa, which is probably either due to the West African kingdoms and to the slave trade, and Morocco as well. We trace our roots to southern and western Morocco as well. So there's lots of mixture in that part of the world. I mean, we also had some ancestry from Central Asia and Mongolia because of the Mongol Empire. So basically, my idea is to show how the Middle East, just like many parts of the world, is very mixed and has a very rich legacy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's more about finding out about yourself and your ancestry, and that got you interested in the topic from the beginning. Okay, so you said that you have 45% Egyptian ancestry. Would you think that this qualifies you to say that you are an Egyptian and claim Egyptian history?
To be honest, I was never raised having any idea about being Egyptian, but I know that part of my family is in Egypt as well. Just like being as well Palestinian myself, our family is dispersed across the Middle East, so a big portion of our family is in Egypt, and many of them have become Egyptian. Many of them haven't only known Egypt and nothing else, and they speak the Egyptian dialect. So to be honest, I have no idea, but I grew up knowing that I am Bahraini, Palestinian, and my mom is Lebanese, Bahraini, Italian as well, so mixtures here and there, you know. But for me, I just embrace probably the mixed identity because that's what I understand more. But the fact that I have discovered there is also that Egyptian component has pushed me to want to understand more about Egyptian history as well.
Okay, that's amazing. All right, so I think we can go from here to our first topic, which is what is the difference between North Africans and Arabs? There is a lot of confusion in my comments. A lot of people are being like almost kind of racist and calling me an Arab, even though I don't have Arab ancestry, or just because I speak Arabic, and most North African countries, including the Black North African countries like Sudan, for example, they also were colonized by Arabs, and they also speak Arabic and have a majority of Muslims. But that does not mean that we are Arab. So, what do you think about that?
So to be honest, there are many different answers that we can answer to this question. I feel like one of the easiest ones to start with is to say that there is this idea, a lot of people tend to think that just because a country was colonized by the Muslim forces, that means they became Arab, which is very far from reality. I mean, Islam is just a religion. Just because somebody becomes Muslim does not mean that they become Arab, you see. And Islam started in the Arabian Peninsula. So yes, it is a religion that originated in Arabia, but it doesn't mean that if somebody becomes a Muslim, they become Arab. It's just a religion. And another thing is also that a lot of people tend to look at people of North Africa, like we were talking about before, and they look at people from the Middle East, and we tend to have similarities with our features as well. So they tend to think that North Africans are Arabs, or that Arabs are linked to North Africans. And for me, it is a gray zone, because I understand where people are coming from, but I feel like it's important to talk about the facts as well. Because when you talk about the history of North Africa, I mean, North Africa is one of the richest parts of the world in terms of history and heritage and legacy, all the way from the Amazigh and Berber kingdoms of Northwest Africa to the ancient Egyptian kingdoms as well. I mean, Egypt as a part of the world is a part of the world that has had so many different kingdoms and dynasties, that has had beautifully different elements of different cultures that have made what Egyptian identity is to be. But the thing is that when you look at North African people, when people call North Africans many times just Arab, I feel personally, I may be wrong, but I personally feel that it erases part of North African identity and history, because of the fact that people tend to only look at when North African identity became linked to Arab identity. So personally, I have a lot of friends that are 100% North African, and there's a lot of division around this. So many tell me, no, we are Arab and nothing else. Others tell me, no, we are Amazigh, and others tell me, no, we are completely different. So I feel like even within the community, there is a lot of nuances as well. And in my opinion, I would say that it's interesting to see North African identity as a mixture of both, because you're acknowledging the rich history, you know what I mean, and embracing diversity more than saying, oh, this is this, this is that, you know, and pointing the finger at people and judging. So I feel like sometimes in the case of North Africa, which is a part of the world that has had such a complex history, it's interesting to embrace the diversity and understand why people think of North Africans as Arab and what makes people think that, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, so now there was also a lot of confusion about the Arab slave trade. So, yes, so a lot of people in my comments are African American, and they know that some of their ancestry might have been involved in the Arab slave trade. So I think they want to learn about that. They want to learn about that history. So can you tell us about it? By the way, I have no idea about the Arab slave trade. I zero knowledge about it, honestly.
So I think one of the things that we first need to talk about is the fact that slavery is obviously one of the most horrible things that has ever happened to human history, regardless of wherever it happened. But the thing is that slavery was present around the world in cultures everywhere, all the way from Central Asia, the Middle East, Africa to Europe, and all the way to the Americas. So the thing is that you can't say that one culture has been solely responsible for slavery, which is something that I hear a lot of people talk about. But yes, 100% there was the Arab slave trade, and it was one of the lengthiest slave trades in human history. It was also very gruesome. But the thing is that, just like we were talking about before, even ancient Egypt had slavery before the arrival of Islam. So the thing is that the component of religion didn't really play a crucial role in this sense. However, when the Arabs began spreading the religion of Islam to North Africa, or they began spreading the religion of Islam to different parts of the world, which became the Islamic world, we saw a revival of slavery, which is something that was very confusing for a lot of thinkers at the start, because the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when he first started to promote the religion of Islam, some of the first people who were against him were his own people from the Qurayshi tribe, because of the fact that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he was actually from the poorest clan of the Qurayshi tribe. whereas many of his fellow leaders of the tribe, they were the wealthiest people. And many of these wealthy men, they were actually the men that were responsible for the slave trade. Many of them were selling slaves, and many of them were dealing in the slave trade. However, it's important as well to understand that at that time, slavery did not link itself to any geographical location. So when the Arabs were enslaving people, they were not just enslaving Africans. They were enslaving Europeans, they were enslaving Caucasian populations, and even Central Asians. I mean, there was a very big portion in human history, in the history of the Middle East, when some of the biggest communities of slaves were Eastern European, and they were known as the white slaves of Arabia. I mean, there was even a book that was reading on. Exactly, and that's something that a lot of people don't know because people racialize slavery. And that's the thing, when people racialize slavery, they completely remove the fact that blackness has nothing to do with slavery, nothing to do. But the issue is that people have racialized it. So when you look at the transatlantic slave trade, which is one of my areas of focus, and the Arab slave trade, one of the biggest things that we can say is that the Arab slave trade was economical, whereas the transatlantic that happened with the Europeans when they took West Africans and brought them to the Americas, they racialized it. So the Portuguese, they arrived in West Africa, and what happened is that they ended up seeing themselves as better than the African people that were living there. And then you see, when you read the literature, you see how they started using words to offend people, racial words, you see? And that's how the slave trade became racialized, and that's how we see the emergence of these terms like white and black and all of these things that led to a lot of the racism and institutional racism that is present today in the Western world. However, in the Middle East, it was different because it did not start with African people. It started with mixed people. You had mixed communities. And a lot of people don't even know that Arabs were enslaving Arabs as well before they were enslaving other people.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. One of the things that we need to understand as well is that when you look at slavery in the Middle East, it's very similar as well to slavery in the African continent. Because in Africa, just like in the Middle East, I say that we are known for tribes, which we call in Arabic qaba'il. The idea of tribes is very important in Arab and African identity because tribes, just like ethnic groups, that's how identity comes about. However, the issue is that when different tribes go to war, many times when one tribe wins, the other tribe loses. So the tribe that wins will capture people from the tribe that lost, and they will turn these, what they call losers, into enslaved people. They will enslave them. And that's how slavery happened within the same race or ethnic group many times. That's how Arabs began enslaving other Arabs before Islam. When Islam arrived,
Sorry, I just have a small question. So would you say that slavery originated in the Arab world?
No. I feel like slavery was present everywhere because at the same time that you see slavery in the Middle East, you see it in Europe, you see it within different African kingdoms in West Africa and Southern Africa, you see it in Central Asia. So slavery for me, I do not believe that it is tied to one place. You see it everywhere in so many different cultures. I may not say every culture because I don't know about every culture, but I have seen it in so many different cultures around the world at the same time.
Okay.
You see?
Yeah, so on to your next point.
I was reading a book a while back. It was called White Gold, and it was talking about the ways in which Muslim people from the Middle East and North Africa at a certain point in time enslaved over 1 million white Europeans. And many of them were brought to North Africa, especially to Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, and they were enslaved. Many of them were converted to Islam, and then depending on the kingdom and society, they dealt with slaves differently because of the fact that when Islam spread from one place to another, then you had the different kingdoms. You had the Almohad, you had the Idrisids, you had the Fatimi Caliphate. So every caliphate had different rules and regulations, and the ways in which they deal with people is very different as well. So the thing is that when you look at the history of slavery in the Arab world, what is very interesting is that even though sadly, and very, very sadly, slavery was present, but the thing is that you couldn't really tell who was a slave and who wasn't a slave through physical features because the Middle East has always been a very diverse place. And even at the time of Islam, under the beginning of the religion, when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was spreading the religion, I mean, you had people of all different shades of colors who were either under the label, the identity of Arab, and then you were called Ajam. In Arabic, we have the term Ajam, which usually means foreigner. At a certain period in Islamic history, it was used to refer to people of one part of the world, and as history evolved, they used the term Ajam for different parts of the world, and sometimes just to mean foreigner. So that's why when you look at the Islamic world, the early age of Islam, it was very difficult to tell if somebody was a slave or not from physical features. That's why I say that slavery was not racialized like it was in the Atlantic world. When you saw somebody because of probably their complexion or their features, and you could tell that they probably were a slave. The Middle East was very complex because at the same time that you had the enslavement of East Africans, you also had the enslavement of Caucasian people that were brought from Circassia, the Chechens, the Georgians, the Armenians, and the Balkans. So it was very mixed at the time as well.
So the Arabs did not discriminate when it came to slavery. They just took everyone.
In the early days, it wasn't. But as we get closer to modernity, you have that idea of racism and discrimination. So, for example, you would say that in the early days of the Islamic empires and the caliphates, you didn't have the idea of race. However, if we really want to understand how slavery became racialized in the Middle East, we need to look at one word, and that Arabic word is the word abd. The word abd in Arabic just means slave. It has nothing to do with color, nothing to do with race. It's just a word that means slave. It literally translates to it. And just to showcase how the word abd has nothing to do with race, one just needs to look at the way that we say we have an expression in the Middle East or in the Arab world in general saying, Kullana abid Allah, we are all the slaves of God.
Yes,
so there's no discrimination in terms of color. However, there were a lot of wealthy Arab merchants under the early days of Islam and even after that began using cherry-picking verses of the Hadith and of the Quran to serve their interests, which goes against that's why we say that unfortunately religion sometimes was used by people for their own power. But that does not mean that that's the truth. That's what I always say. If you want to know the true Islam, you don't look at us Muslims. We are not perfect. You look at the scriptures. You look at the book. We all have sinned, and we all either have done bad things. We all continue to do, depending on the person. But we are not perfect. It is the scriptures that are. So if somebody wants to truly understand the religion, they need to look at the teachings, not at the people today. Because many times as well, you will find that whether in political powers or people today within conversations, they will utilize religion for their own benefit. You see? Yes. So that's something that you see when Islam began to spread at the early days in Hijaz under the Prophet Muhammad, when he was sharing his teachings about Islam. There were lots of people that were very angry with him because of the fact that many of the people that were engaged in the slave trade, buying and selling people as slaves, they were the ones that revolted against the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, because he was one of the first people to ever share this idea of equality. You see, and equality became tied to spirituality and faith, because in Islam the idea was that everybody would be equal in front of God. So that was an idea that was completely new, but that threatened the economic benefits.
So that's your business.
Exactly. That is why you see a lot of people after the Prophet Muhammad died, many of them, they began to use Islam and to say that, no, it's okay to enslave non-Muslims. And that's why there is a lot of controversy even within the Islamic tradition. You have some scholars that said it was allowed, some scholars that said it was not allowed. But I feel like if you really want to understand the true opinion, if somebody can say true opinion, I mean, just look at the Prophet Muhammad, what he did. He used to say that God rewards people that free slaves. So if God rewards people that free slaves, how can you justify enslaving people? I mean, isn't it contradictory? So I don't know. This is why we say that it is very complex, but sometimes you also need to go back to the original teachings to understand. There's a factor that we know in Arabic to be Tariq al-Harir, which is the Silk Road. And the same thing, that stretched all the way from China to Europe. And what did you have in the middle? The Middle East. So when that happened, you had Arabs that were trading with East Asians and Central Asians, and they were trading with Europeans, just like you had North Africans and even East Africans that were coming to the Middle East to sell their goods and services. So, for example, in Egypt, what was interesting is that under different kingdoms after the arrival of Islam, you had the Egyptians that had signed treaties with the kingdom of Nuba, which in English is Nubia, which is called Upper Egypt, but on the map is in the south. So, for example, the Egyptians, they would bring textiles And the Nubians, they would bring people and sell them as slaves for an economic purpose, and it was signed decrees as well. But that changed depending on the kingdom as well. So it changed over time. And you see the same thing as well with Ethiopia. With Ethiopia, the case was that they were sending people as slaves many times to the Hijaz. So the Hijaz is Western Arabia, which is located in modern-day Saudi Arabia and Yemen. It's the entire coastline that you see where you have the three main cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jeddah. And these were the port cities, which is where not only were slaves coming in, but also goods and services as well. And you had the import of spices, and that is how coffee was created as well. It was brought from Ethiopia to Yemen. And through the Red Sea trade, this is why I say that I'm not only focused on Egypt, I focus on the Red Sea in general as well, because it shows how Africa and the Middle East, because on the western side of the Red Sea of Africa, on the eastern side of the Red Sea, you have Arabia, and how they came together through this very small sea that managed to connect both of the parts of the world. And this is actually one of the reasons why you have, when Islam arrived in Egypt, they chose the general Amr ibn As to bring Islam to Egypt, because he was known under the Khalifa Umar to have already had a lot of experience in Egypt, because he had traveled to Alexandria when he was a kid, and he said, I know of the great wealth of the Egyptian civilization. He said, so I know what they have, and I know of the potential of this part of the world. So this is why they gave him the role to bring Islam to Egypt.
So he came to Egypt, Amr ibn al-As, he came to Egypt when he was very young, and then he returned again to...
So he was back in Arabia, and then when they decided the Futuhat al-Islamiyya, which is the Islamic expansion to expand Islam to different parts of the world, because it's important to understand that at that time, the Muslims were mainly in Arabia, which in Arabic we call Jiziya al-Arabiya, which is the Arabian Peninsula, so modern day the countries of the Gulf. So at that time, you had two very big empires in the north of Arabia. You had in the east, you had the Sasanian Empire, which was modern-day Iran, Persia. And in the west, you had the Byzantine, which is located in modern-day Anatolia, Turkey. So the Arabs were essentially trying to expand their scopes of power and to see how they could weaken these two empires in the north. And how could they weaken them is to get bigger and to get more powerful. So they sent armies to the north, to Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, which we call in Arabic Sham or Bilad al-Sham, to expand and to allow Islam to have a proper foothold there. And that is how that area over time became Arabized, which we might talk about later. And the same thing, then they decided to go west. And because there was a lot of stories and traditions and like even poetry that was talking about the glory of ancient Egypt. So a lot of people would imagine if Islam could reach to this territory. So Amr ibn As, essentially, the Khalifa Umar, he went to Egypt. And as he was going to Egypt, Khalifa Umar, he was not sure if he should go there or not. So then he had sent, there was this whole story about how he had sent a letter with a messenger, and it had to reach Amr before he went into Egypt. If Amr had already crossed into Egypt, into the Sinai Peninsula, he was allowed to continue. But if he was in the area of Palestine, he could go back. And at that time, he took the letter, he didn't read it, and he went inside to the Sinai. And then when he opened it, he said, we're already inside, so let's continue. So at that time, there were 4,000 soldiers that were brought from Arabia. He sent another 4,000. So at the time when he arrived, it was 8,000. And then under the Khalifa, they said, you know what? How can 8,000 people probably conquer this huge territory? Let us send 4,000 more. So at the end of the arrival, there were 12,000. Mm-hmm. And then what happened is that it's important to understand that the arrival of the Arabs in Egypt, just like we said, the Arabs brought Islam to Egypt, it was very gradual as well. Yes, there was a Futuhat al-Islamiyya, but over time, you had the Islamic dynasty, you had the Turanid dynasty, you had the Ayyubids, and because the Arabs arrived in Egypt in the year 639. And from the year 639 until the year 642, this is when you see they were properly trying to arrive in Egypt and make their way. And out of all of the areas of Egypt, one of the hardest ones for the Arabs to take control of was Nuba, in the area of Nubia. And very interestingly enough, that is what is called Upper Egypt. When they arrived there, many of the forces, over 250 the Arab soldiers were blinded because of the fact that the Nubians were known to be the strongest archers in the world in the sport of archery. So basically, they managed to completely annihilate so much of the Arab soldiers because they were very skilled archers. But then over time, you had the Arabs that were coming back again and were trying to sign agreements because the kingdom of Nubia was Christian. So over time, that's how they accepted Islam. And there were so many discussions that came back and forth. You had decrees, you had the Arab armies that were coming and going. So that's how it became a gradual thing. But
let's focus on the Egyptian kingdom.
Yeah.
Was there a lot of resistance when the Arabs came to Egypt itself, or so there was war?
There was resistance, and that's the thing. I mean, it depends where you look at Egypt. Because I remember I was studying this a while back, and they said that one area that didn't resist a lot, that they were actually accepting of the Arabs, was the Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula. Because there the Bedou were living, which we call the Bedouins. And they were
already very close, to that.
It's very close to Arab identity. Some of the hardest areas to take control of was the city of Scandaria, which is Alexandria, because of the fact that it had been a port city. So you had the influence of the Byzantines, and then the indigenous Egyptians, the Copts, the Coptic Al-Qibtiyin, which we call in Arabic. And when the Arabs arrived in Egypt, there were two main languages that were spoken in Egypt at that time in the 7th century. You had the language of the aristocracy and the language of the people. So one of the main languages of the aristocracy was Greek. It was like spoken by the educated masses and all of these different people that were highly benefited. And then you had the language of many of the people was the Coptic language. And the very fascinating thing is that the Coptic language has so much ancestry from the ancient Egyptian languages and the different dialects that were spoken in ancient Egypt. And I remember I was reading this scientific analysis that was done, and they said that apparently the Coptic people until today do have the DNA, a portion of their DNA that goes back to the ancestral kingdoms before the arrival of the modern era, which is very interesting as well. That's why I say, like, if people want to know more about the history of Egypt, like, just ask Egyptian people, like, how, like, it's like when people, I remember there was this one time I was talking about Arab history, and there was this person who was not Arab and was like, no, I know more. Like, how do you know more? Like, but that's the thing, like, if you really want to know about the history of the people, yes, you can listen to experts from around the world, but I feel like the most important voice should be given to the people from that country, because they know their history, they know their culture, they know their heritage more than other people. So, yeah. But
exactly, and this is why I actually brought you on the show, by the way. I could have just went and did my research and read about the Arab slave trade and the Islamic invasions and all of that, but I did not want to speak on somebody else's history. I'd rather bring a person who is like the original, an indigenous person from that area that knows their own history very well, so they can speak on it. I don't want to misrepresent anybody's history like some people are doing with ours.
There was even the talk about, you know, how when the Arabs arrived in the area of Egypt at that time, and when we say how the Egyptian people who were known and they were described as the Coptic people, when they arrived, there was different amounts of resistance. Like, that's the question you're asking me, if they accepted or if they resisted. So many of them resisted and some accepted, depending on where they were living. And I remember one thing that was actually very interesting was that they said that one of the easiest parts of Egypt for the Arabs to take control of was the west of Egypt, because it's the Sahara, it's the desert, and that reminded the Arabs of back home, of the Arabian Peninsula, you see. So that just goes to show how environment can many times help people understand an area or take control of an area or master the natural environment, you see. Whereas along the Nile Valley, it was completely different from different parts of Arabia. So this is why you had different, especially in Egypt, many of the cities were built around the Nile River, because of the fact that the Nile River was seen as the giver of life, especially even in ancient Egypt. That's why you had all the agriculture, and all of the cities were built that way there as well. But there was one Coptic bishop from the Coptic church. His name was John, and I forgot his last name. He was living at the time of when the Arabs invaded, and he was talking about, because he witnessed with his own eyes how the Arabs either assimilated or if they didn't assimilate and what happened or not. And one of the things that I remember he had criticized, and I completely understand this, is how he said that one thing that the Arabs had done was that at the end, when they took Egypt, was that they made it economical. So one thing is that, there is the Jizya tax, and that is the tax that the Arabs or the Muslims in general would implement on a territory that they conquered. So then that could give them revenue, and that would help the state get more wealthy over time so that they could conquer more territory and build more palaces and, obviously do different things with the money that they would take. So this is one of the reasons that I think it was during the 11th or the 12th century, the Arabs that were living in Egypt that came from the Middle East, together with the Copts, they revolted together against many of the governors that were taking orders from the Khalifa, the Caliphate, because of the fact that they were taking so much wealth from the people, and many of the people were underprivileged and didn't have as much. So they were working in agriculture, they were working in the fields, they were working outside, so it was very hard labor, hard work. And over the years, they were told to give more and more in taxes. So you see the Coptic people, the Egyptian people, coming together with the Arabs, and they fought against the governors. And that's how you see more solidarity over time. But obviously, there were also lots of instances of violence that you saw. And many times the violence was even done against the Byzantines by the Arabs because the Byzantines were Christians. So that's how you have the religious factor. But then you have many of the Copts that were forced to assimilate many times as well. And they were made Muslim, especially under the Fatimid Caliphate. The Fatimid Caliphate is one of the three main Islamic Khalifa, and you have one of the leaders of the Khalifa, he was called Al-Hakim, and out of all the Khalifas in the Islamic world, he was known to be, people used to call him a bit mental at the time because of the fact that he was known to take very weird decisions. One of the decisions that he took is actually to destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which was a Christian church. And he also took the decision to destroy different churches in Egypt. And this is why people were saying at the time that many of the Egyptian people were forced to become Muslim, not because they wanted, but because of the fact that the ruler was saying you need to become Muslim. Yeah, so this is one of the instances. And usually there were three different rules. Either you accept to pay the tax and you live wherever you are now. You can stay a Christian, you can stay a Jew, you can have any religion you want if you pay the tax. Or you do not and you revolt against us, or we kick you out of the empire. But the thing is that under Al-Hakim, he said, no, you either convert or you pay the tax, and many of them didn't want to pay the tax, so they were forced to convert. So that's how you see, it's always linked to power. If anybody can understand anything from this episode, many times it's linked to power. And that's why sometimes it can be very hard to generalize as well, because depending on the ruler takes different decisions, and his decisions can influence the people in different ways. So before Al-Hakim, many of the Egyptian people were free to practice whatever form of religion that they wanted, and especially many were Christians, the Coptic Church. But over time after, many of them were forced to become Muslim. Not all, but many of them were. So that's how over time things happened. And then you have the Mamluks, who made Arabic the main language. And many of the Egyptian people used to speak the Coptic language, but because of the fact that the Mamluks made the Arabic the language of the governors and the administration, the political administration, they wanted to know what was going on. So they were in a way incited to learn the Arabic language. So that's how Arabic ended up taking the place of other languages.
Yeah, so basically, first of all, when the Islamic invasion came in, they started to spread Islam, and slowly it started to spread. Not in one day everybody became Muslim, everybody spoke Arabic. This is the misunderstanding over here. It took a long, long time for Egypt to become a majority Muslim country and speaking the Arabic language as the main language. By the way, Coptic is still spoken in churches. A lot of people speak it fluently. So yeah,
it's a very nice language.
It is. And actually our Egyptian Arabic, as you know, our Egyptian Arabic is very different from the Arabic that is spoken in the Arab Peninsula. And it does have a mixture of Coptic in there. A lot of our words are actually derived from the Coptic language. But my question to you is, so how many Arabs stayed in Egypt approximately? Because this is where the confusion is. A lot of people are trying to say that when the Arabs came into Egypt, they replaced the indigenous Coptic Egyptians, which are us, and it became a majority of Arabs
when you look at the arrival of the Arabs, when they first arrived in Egypt during the first wave of the conquest, there were 12,000. But then, depending on the caliphate and depending on the political power that was there at the time, you had either more arrival of the Arabs or less arrival of the Arabs. For example, under the Fatimids, and if I'm not mistaken, under the Tulunids as well, you had the arrival of many Bedouin Arabs from the peninsula that were brought to Upper Egypt, the south. So that's how you see waves of migration from the Arabian Peninsula, but you also see it from the Levant, you see. So it happened gradually, but the thing is that when it comes to numbers, I obviously don't know, but I do not believe what many people say, that the Arabs came and they replaced the Egyptian people. Like, that does not make factual sense. You cannot wipe out a civilization. You cannot wipe out people. And one of the things, if I can say as well, is that probably one of the reasons why a lot of people say this is because of the fact that ancient Egyptians, just like many different people from North Africa, belong to an ancient group of people that were linked to the Arabs. Because originally the people of Arabia, the people of the Levant, and the people of North Africa are believed to be linked to the Semitic people, and they have a link which goes back to ancient times, you see. So this is why people talk about like the features and all these things.
We are geographically very close to each other. And if you look at any part of the world, when you see two countries or two areas that are close to each other, you can see that the people kind of look similar, especially to outsiders that can't tell the difference.
Exactly.
So we know how to tell the difference. Like Middle Easterns know when they see an Egyptian, they know. When they see like a Saudi, they know. But other people, they see us all looking exactly the same, and they just automatically put this Arab category on us.
And you have no idea how many times people think that Arab is the same thing as Muslim. They're like, oh yeah, you speak Muslim. Like, what do you mean? How can I speak Muslim? I've had people ask me if I speak Islamic. I'm like, never mind. But I remember even one very interesting thing that you say, that because we all come from the same area, we have similarities, but yet we have our own differences as well. If you look at many of the ancient Egyptian temples, what's very interesting is that they were masters of art. And just like I can see the art behind you as well. And the different art is that they managed to represent different people with their art. You see, and I feel like this is just my opinion as well. I may be right or I may be wrong. However, my idea is that our idea of race is different from the idea of race that was promoted during colonialism.
Yeah.
You see, because race can be utilized in a very strategic way. And the way that they utilize race is as well for power. Because if you can put all so many people differently together and you label them as one thing, you have power over these people. And the ways in which colonialism essentially promoted this idea of race as white versus brown versus black, it essentially made people believe that everybody who is brown has the same identity, everybody who's black has the same identity. Yet that also removes so much of the beautiful diversity and the richness of our cultures within brown and black identity as well, you see.
Yeah.
So if you look at the ancient Egyptian temples as well, the way that they would depict the different tribes and different people, they used to even depict the Berbers. So there was the Siwa oasis, and you had even more west, they would go all the way to Morocco. The whole area of the Maghreb, that they call, is an area where the Berbers were living. And the Egyptians used to trade with the Berbers as well, just like they used to trade with the Nubians, they used to trade with the Ethiopians, they traded with people from across the continent of Africa, as well as with people from the Middle East and the Near East, which is why if you look, there are some instances where they depicted people from different tribes and different parts of the world. You can see they each have their own clothing, they each have their own headset, they each have their own features, the skin color. So there was this knowledge back then, but the thing is that if people don't look at that, they will think that everything was the same. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
But there was a lot of diversity as well.
I think the problem is applying modern concepts like race onto ancient civilizations that did not practice these ideas and did not have them at all.
Exactly, 100%. And that's the thing, because race is very subjective as well. Like, two people may look at one person or at a whole identity and perceive them differently. It depends on what you think. It depends on, are you relying only on color? Are you relying on features? Are you relying on hair texture? It depends, you see? So that's why it makes the topic very complex as well, and that's why we need to say that opinions sometimes are used as a general rule. Just because somebody has this opinion, they make it look like everybody must be that way, you know?
Yes. There's somebody also that's always commenting, please let Karim talk about the genocide. that happened in Egypt. Was there any genocide in Egypt from the Islamic invasion?
I do not know if we can talk about genocide in the context of ancient Egypt, just because of the fact that from what I know, what happened when the Arabs arrived, it was a gradual thing. I obviously have no idea when we talk about genocide in Egypt, because I have never heard of anything talking about genocide in the context of Egyptian history or Arab history in that case.
Yeah, I think they're referring to like kind of a genocide that happened to the Native Americans. And they're comparing that to us, saying that this is what happened when the Arabs came to Egypt. They genocided the indigenous Egyptians and they replaced the population with Arabs.
But that's the thing, like, if you think about it as well, it's very difficult to talk about how Arabs completely wiped out, because the thing is that the Arabs were a minority at the time, so it's very difficult for the minority to wipe out the majority. I mean, no matter how much the Arabs were arriving in Egypt, the Egyptian people were still more numerous. It was their country.
There were 8 million Egyptians.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like when the Arabs arrived, they were 12,000. So how can 12,000 remove 8 million? And that's the thing, because if you just look at geographically as well, when the Arabs arrived in Nubia, they couldn't even they couldn't take control of Nubia the first time. It had to be gradual over time. You see? So in the context of Lower Egypt, that was also very different. But the thing is that you didn't see a wiping out of the population. Even if anybody wants to go and read the archives, read the history, you see that this happened through a gradual process because of the thing that it was known as Byzantine Africa at that time. So it was Christian. So when the Arabs arrived, their main fight was not against the indigenous Egyptian people. Their fight was against the Byzantines, because they didn't care about wiping out the indigenous people. And most Egyptians today, if they take a DNA test, they will see that they are indigenous Egyptian. I mean, they're not all from the Arab world. They have always probably some ancestry here and there. And that's why we say that everybody is different. Some families have a lineage from one part, whereas other families have lineage from other parts. That's why Egypt was a breeding ground of different identities, but the indigenous identity was always still there, you see. So if you look at, for example, in the context of the Arab arrival, their main fight was against the Byzantines. And when the Arabs were fighting to take control of different Egyptian cities, they were not fighting against the Egyptians, they were fighting against the Byzantine governors. So that's
to kick them out of Egypt so they can replace the government, basically.
Exactly. It was all the idea of who's going to rule this territory. So if you can rule the territory, you have power over the territory. You see what I'm saying? So that's how over time it evolved. And from Egypt, because Egypt was the first territory or country that the Arabs managed to take hold on and put their roots in Africa at the time, they stayed in Egypt for a while, and then from Egypt they went on to the rest of North Africa, the territory that is known today as Tunisia, which was called Ifriqiya, and that's how there's the theory of the title of the name of Africa, because in the medieval terminology they used to call Tunisia Ifriqiya, and then Algeria and Morocco was the area of the Maghreb, which is Al-Maghreb, the Western world, the Western land, and that is where the sun would set. That's why they called it the Maghreb, and that area was known for its Berber people. So they went from Egypt to Tunisia and Libya, and from Tunisia and Libya they went westwards to Algeria and to Morocco as well. So and then Egypt became like the base, you see.
Mm-hmm.
Probably, if you'd like, we can talk about, because remember you asked me about like the relationship between Africa and the Middle East, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like, not just like in the Egyptian context, but like as I know more about a more general context, you know what I mean? So like, for example, the Arab world has always been, or the Middle East has always been in contact with the African continent ever since prehistoric times and in ancient times as well. Before the arrival of Islam as a religion, and before as well as the arrival of Arab identity as we know it today. Because just to understand how history can be very complex as well. I mean, in the Middle East in general, when we talk about the first Arabs, people think of Yemen, because in Arabic there is the saying Yemen Asl al-Arab, which translates to Yemen is the origin of the Arab. Is the origin of the Arab people. So, but the thing is that there are other discoveries that come and go. For example, there were some archaeological discoveries that found things that the Arabs originated in the north of the Arabian Peninsula. So like the north of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Palestine, they found writings there, and they found so many relics that prove that the Arabs were there just at the same time as they were in Yemen as well. So that can show people how many times one thing that we know to be true, like the origin story, can be very different because you may find something on a completely other side as well that may rewrite history completely. I mean, like, my thing here is not that I'm telling people what I think is best. I'm just saying what I know because I believe that history is something that we're constantly discovering new things. And many things that sometimes we believe to be true can be wrong. And this is why it's important for us, especially to look back at our history and understand what happened and why, for what reason, and how does history affect us today. You know?
Yeah, that's amazing. So you told me that you saw a really interesting question that you wanted to answer.
There was one question that I saw that was really interesting. What's the difference between Arab and Arabized?
Yes, I think
so. In this case, I feel like as well, different people have different opinions as well. Because I do.
So this is an opinion, it's not a fact.
Yes. Especially even lots of the things that I was saying right now, I know to be facts, but people have different opinions on them as well, you know?
Okay.
So for example, a lot of the people that come from territories that were Arabized, so territories that were at the origin probably not Arab, but that over time became Arab due to the Arab and the Islamic conquests. So in general, when we talk about the Middle East or the Arab world especially, there are three main parts. We have the Arabian Peninsula, which is the Jiziya al-Arabiya. We have the Levant, which is Bilad al-Sham. And we have North Africa, which is Shamal Afriqiya. In general, when we talk about the origin of the Arab people, we look at the Arabian Peninsula. So the countries of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Bahrain, the UAE, so the entire Gulf. But then when you look at the Levant, you're looking at Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, Syria. These territories were known to have different civilizations and cultures, such as the Phoenicians and the Canaanites. And in North Africa, you had different Berber kingdoms and civilizations, just like the Egyptian pharaohs as well. So when you're talking about territories that were Arabized, that were not Arab at the origin, but that became Arab over time, you're looking in general at North Africa, and you're looking in general at the countries of the Levant. Because at that time, the Arabs came out of the peninsula and they went north, and from north they went west as well. So that's how it started off. Because in general, people use the term Arabize as a cultural thing, you see. It's not necessarily a racial thing. We don't necessarily, from what I know, we don't really think of it in the Middle East as a racial thing. We think of it as a cultural thing, you see.
Exactly, and that's how these American or Westernized ideas are trying to force us into this concept of Arab is a race, but Arab is not really a race. Within the Arab, the people that call themselves Arab because they are culturally Arab or they speak Arabic language, you have different genetics and different ethnicities.
You have different features, different ancestry as well, because basically if anybody wants to understand why the Arab world is very mixed, you just need to look at the map of the world. I mean, the Arab world is literally between Africa, Asia, and Europe. It would make sense that the people of the Arab world would be a mix of everything, of all of these three different continents. And within each continent, there's different ethnic groups and tribes and nations. I mean, you have the Mongol invasion of the Middle East that happened. It first arrived in Iraq, and from Iraq they went completely west. They went to the Levant and to Egypt, and then they went to different parts of the northern Arabian Peninsula. So there's even Mongol ancestry in the Middle East. I mean, I have that as well. For example, my great grandmother originated from Uzbekistan. We have ancestry from the DNA test that showed East Asian and Native American and Mongolian. So this portion of ancestry is linked to history. And the thing is that when people see and don't look at the historical component, many times they can make judgments. But the thing is that when you truly understand why that happened, how is that possible, people will learn more to understand that it's the complete picture that matters the most, you see. Yeah. So in the terms of Arab identity is more of a cultural thing, because the Arabs essentially brought the Arab culture, and when they brought the Arab culture, as well as bringing the religion of Islam, but Islam not being linked to Arab identity, which is very important to understand that Islam does not equal Arab, just like Arab does not equal Islam. But when the Arabs began going to bring Islam, they brought the Arabic language, because the Quran was revealed in Arabic, whether people like it or not. So in order for people to read the Quran, they had to learn the Arabic language. And just to showcase one territory that did not become Arab is Iran. And I mean, it's a territory that has such a rich history and culture that adopted the Islamic religion, but did not adopt Arab identity. Yeah. That just goes to showcase the amount of diversity that is possible.
Yeah, I think we covered everything. Yeah. I don't know, really, I learned a lot of stuff. There was a lot of stuff that I didn't know anything about. And yeah, thank you so much.
And there's much more that I could have even talked about concerning like the Arab slave trade, because that was one of the biggest chapters within the history that I personally study as well, because it did not only touch North Africa or East Africa, it touched the whole Indian Ocean. So it linked African people with Arab people, with Asian people, with people from South Asia and Southeast Asia. So that just goes to show how like the more you find one piece of the puzzle, the more you're going to have different question marks as well. And you look from one thing to another and you'll see how many of us are connected. And we're connected the more we look at history.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that this episode is going to raise a bunch of new questions in people's minds, that you're going to see them in the comments that are more advanced because now they know more, which is great because it's knowledge. You're spreading knowledge, and that's really amazing. Anyways, thank you so much for being on the Kemet show. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And hopefully we can do another one soon.
Definitely. Thank you for having me, and I hope I managed to bring some justice to our history.
Thank you so much, Karim.
Thank you.
Okay. Serious start.
What was I going to say?
Wait, I forgot.
I forgot. Oh my goodness.